Okay, good afternoon, morning, evening to everyone, depending on where you are. Welcome to the GCF Watch webinar series for the year 2022. Let's give it a few seconds for everyone to join, as I see that attendees are still joining the room, and then we will start soon with the program. So maybe I'll just give it another minute. Our apologies as well for the late start. We had difficulties, some technical difficulties, but we'll just wait for another minute and then begin with our webinar. Okay, well, I think in the interest of time, let's begin, and others can still join later on. Again, welcome to everyone. As you know, this webinar series has interpretation for those who want to listen to what's being said in their preferred language, whether that's Spanish, French, or Portuguese. The instructions for how to use it are being shown right now on the screen, but basically you'll have a sign with at the bottom right of your screen that says interpretation, and from there you can choose the language you would prefer to listen to this webinar in. As you all know, this is the part 2 of the 3rd session of our international webinar series, and this one, for those that were here before and those that weren't here before, this is this 3rd session is based on the topics that were identified by participants at the end of the 1st session. So, you know, at the end of the 1st session, we had a survey to identify what topics civil society and participants in general found interesting and wanted to know more about concerning the GCF. And so we drew a list of those that were, you know, seen as more relevant, and we've had this is the 2nd session in which we've tried to address those topics. So basically, this session will focus on some critical aspects of the proposals. Basically, you know, the proposals that are being presented by the GCF by accredited entities that will eventually become approved projects, and especially including tips to review these proposals, because for those of you who have been involved in this, you'll find that those proposals are not very easy to review or understand. And so, you know, we have developed certain tips on how to go about it to facilitate engagement with the GCF and its proposals. We'll also have a look at important aspects of gender, indigenous peoples, and also and also about the different types of projects, approaches, and what the relationship is between those projects and approaches to what we know as false solutions. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to all of you our speakers for today. I'll introduce them one by one as they begin speaking. So our first speaker is Florencia Ortúzar from the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense, AIDA. And she will speak to us a little bit about how one goes about reviewing funding proposals for the GCF from her extensive experience in this, and what are the tips and ways to make it a little bit more easy to understand these often very complex documents that you'll see when you are looking at a funding proposal. So with that, I would like to leave the floor to Florencia. Please post your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, and we will have at the end of our presentations a little bit of time to engage with our panelists and discuss a little bit of the points that you find particularly interesting. So Florencia, please.
Thank you, Berta. Thank you, everyone. This is very exciting to be in our last session of this 4-session webinar that we prepared this year. And as Berta said, we ended up doing 2 third sessions because of all the topics that were interesting to the public. So my presentation is going to be quite practical. And as Berta was saying, it's going to be about how do you address these enormous funding proposals when they get to your hands. They can be really, really overwhelming, but because they always follow the same structure and because there have been years now of doing this, we have gathered some tips which we think are really interesting to share to you. So, well, first of all, I'm Florencia Ortúzar. I'm from Chile. I work in the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense, which is a regional NGO in Latin America that works to protect the environment. And one of the things we do is that we act as the regional nodes of the GCF Watch, which is the promoter of this series of webinars. So what we do as part of the GCF Watch is we try to connect all the work we do around the GCF in the world, and especially being the regional node for Latin America, our main objective is to build a sort of bridge between what goes on at the board level with all those civil society organizations that are working there, where decisions are being made, and those board members that are taking those decisions, with the people that are in the territories receiving the projects. Because many times we find that projects are not what we expected, are not the best use of money, and it almost always has to do with a lack of connection with what people really know and think in their territories where they receive the project. So that's like the introduction. So please pass the next slide, Victor. Well, that was Aida. And then, well, pass to the next one, please. So funding proposals are long and complex documents. They are always in English. They can be over 100 pages, and they often include, and they include annexes. So of course they are very, very overwhelming. They have technical information, and many times we just don't know where to begin. But as I was saying, it is possible to crack them because there are some key aspects that you can look into. So the next one, please. So in AIDA, we wrote this guide. Well, it's a long guide about many issues around the GCF and how to engage with the GCF in different aspects. But one of the chapters, which I think is one of the most interesting chapters of this guide, is specifically on how to review funding proposals. This guide is available in English, Portuguese, and Spanish. So you can download it, send you the link afterwards, but you can easily find it also. So here we sort of, all that I'm going to explain now is a bit like written down, so you can then use it when you are trying to review a funding proposal. So the idea basically is that we highlight some like key aspects of the funding proposals that you should look into, and we sort of propose some questions that it's important to make to yourself while you are reviewing. And we sort of suggest that you write down anything that is doubtful or worrying or that is not very clear. And then we sort of have like a proposal of how to make your contribution. And the interesting thing is that the contribution that you make when you review a funding proposal goes straight to the civil society organizations that are working around the GCF, that are from all parts of the world, so they make part of the interventions that in the end, the active observer of the GCF does in the meeting rooms. So your reviews can be part of what is said to the board members directly, so that they consider aspects of the funding proposals that might be overlooked by decision makers, that might be not well contained in these funding proposals that are many times written by accredited entities and not sufficiently done with the participation of the people. Okay, so next one, please. So first of all, obviously, time is always pressing. Funding proposals are generally published 21 days before the board meeting where they will be decided upon. So this is only 3 weeks. And category A and B projects, these are the ones that have that could generate impacts, more graver environmental and social impacts, have to publish their impact studies, environmental and social impact studies, before 120 days for category A and 30 days for category B. But still funding proposals, we only have 3 weeks to review them. So what we do in an effort to collect all these reviews and insights from the people in the territories, from the communities that are affected, and from the people that are working with those communities, is that as soon as we get the information, we share them with all our networks, in my case in Latin America, and try to find communities and organizations that are close to the project, because that is the information that we want to get. That is what we need. So the next one, please. So first, the funding proposals have a lot of chapters, and the first one is the executive summary, which we obviously recommend that you start by there, because this is a chapter which is 1.5 pages long, more or less, so it's not very long, where the accredited entity explains what the project or program is about. It explains how the problem that it wants to solve is associated to climate change, what are the proposed actions, and what are the expected impacts and benefits. So you can always start there. Next one, please. Then there is a whole section on the project program information, which is all the general information. Here you can find, for example, the different components of a project or program, which is something very interesting. Like, it gives you a very good idea of what they are proposing in the end. And while you review this chapter, you can ask yourself if the purpose and objectives of the project or program are clear, if they are seeking into some vulnerabilities they want to address. What is the relation of the project to climate change? Is there clarity about the activities they are proposing within the different components of the project? Then something very interesting to ask yourself is, do you have any information about the organizations or companies that are going to implement the project? How are their, human rights performance history? Do you have any articles on these organizations? You might actually want to Google them up a little bit to see what's their history, if they seem like adequate to perform, to implement a project that is supposed to benefit communities. Here, for example, once I wanted to bring a case study. We were analyzing a case in Argentina, which was near Buenos Aires, and they were proposing adaptation measures to deal with problems of flooding in this place. So if you read the proposal, maybe it sounded good, but when we started investigating, we realized that what had happened was that they had built all these residential areas on top of wetlands. So obviously there was flooding because they hadn't thought about maintaining the natural ecosystem of the rivers that deals with these floodings naturally. So the project was very focused on building more channels and more infrastructure, and there was nothing related to bringing back the ecosystem service that had been ruined with all the projects on top of it. So that is something very interesting sort of that we find out when we start asking people what they really think of a project, people that have that local knowledge. The next one, please. The next section is on the expected performance against investment criteria. This is really interesting because what the funding proposal does is that it puts the 6 expected performance, the investment criteria that the ITAP uses to evaluate projects. The ITAP is the Independent Technical Advisory Panel, which is a group of experts that analyze every proposal. And they use this criteria. So the accredited entity, when he writes the funding proposal, must go over each of the criteria and explain why the project works in this sense. So these are impact potential, paradigm shift potential, sustainable development, needs of the recipient, so of the people that are going to be benefited, country ownership, how does this project go in line or not with what the country needs really with their internal policies on climate change, and efficiency and effectiveness. So this is actually a very interesting place to look at because you can sort of ask all the questions around this important criteria. So then while you're reading this chapter, you can ask yourself, does it really respond to the needs of the peoples and communities that it seeks to benefit? Does it safeguard the human rights of beneficiaries? Does it include climate justice? Does it take care of issues related to equity, to gender equity? Is it aligned with the climate policies of the country, etc.? Then the next one, please. Another important aspect to look into always is what's happened with the involvement of local communities. And then you have a chapter on environmental and social risk assessments, which summarizes the consultation processes and plans for the stakeholders that were carried out to make them participate in the design and implementation of the project. There's also sometimes an annex. It's only available for the public sector proposals. Private sector proposals give less information than public ones. The public sector proposals also always include a summary of consultations and stakeholder engagement plans. Obviously, this is very important, and especially for what we're trying to do, because what we're trying to do is basically bring up the opinions of the people on the territory. So we really want to know if the participation processes were adequate, because maybe the accredited entity gives an idea that they were, but when you speak to people, it might be different. So that's very valuable information that you can get from the real people in the territories. So does the community agree with this proposal? Is it aligned with the local needs and realities? Was the information delivered, the consultation and participation processes adequate? And then you have to ask, are there any indigenous communities involved? Because if there are, you have to start using the indigenous people policies. And it sometimes happens that funding proposals say explicitly that there are no indigenous people going to be affected. And when we look into the proposals, there are. So that's a very important thing to ask. And well, and so on. Then we have the next one, please. The environmental and social risks, which is obviously also very important. And this is a review of the possible impacts that the project might cause and the possible, and the proposed mitigation and compensation measures. So then you have to look into the environmental and social risk assessment, which gives an explanation of all this, and ask yourself some questions with the idea that activities financed by the GCF should not cause negative social, environmental, or economic impacts. That's the whole point. So you have to ask yourself, what are the most serious potential social and environmental risk associated with this project? Are they really likely? Are they serious? How are there appropriate mitigation or compensation measures for each of these risks? Have all the potential impacts been identified? Has there been consideration of cumulative impacts? For example, if there are other infrastructure projects in the same area, is that considered? Is there an adequate budget to manage all these impacts? So those are some of the questions that you can start asking yourselves and take note. Then there's the gender approach. The next one, please. And here, all financial proposals, from public and private entities, must include an evaluation and a gender action plan as an annex. So this is a very important document to analyze. And then you can ask yourself, with regards to the evaluation, which does like a pre-evaluation of the gender situation where the project is going to be implemented, does the gender assessment present updated and relevant information for this particular project? Or is it only using other sources and sort of citing? Was there like a serious work being done here? And then with regards to the action plans, you can ask yourself, are there measures proposed to ensure gender equality, but more beyond just making sure that 50% of beneficiaries are women? Like, did they really do a good job there? Are there actions included to empower women, for example, to give them participation in decision-making or to give them real capacity building? This one is, I also think it's very important. Were there any actions carried out to ensure that local knowledge is considered when designing a project? The local knowledge of women, which is many times overlooked, which is a pity because it's so important. Is there an adequate budget for the plan? And a very simple thing to look into is there a gender expert who is going to participate beyond a short-term consultancy? How serious are they with all those important like monitoring about the gender aspects of the proposal? So the next one. So that's more or less a quick walk through the main aspects that you can look into when you're looking into a funding proposals. Then another interesting advice that I like to give is other places where you look. Apart from the funding proposals, we also get access to the assessment that the ITAP does, the Independent Technical Advisory Panel. And it's an interesting place to look into because the ITAP does like a revision of all the investment criteria that I was mentioning before. So you can read those and sort of try to see if they are in line with what you thought, and this obviously can strengthen your arguments, or if they are completely different. And then you can sort of pinpoint to things that are not clear, maybe misunderstood, maybe overlooked. And for public proposals, you can also look into the Secretariat's assessment. This is not available for private. proposals. But that is very interesting. It's similar in structure to the ITAFs. So those can also be used to sort of strengthen your arguments. And then another thing that is really interesting, I think, is if the project or program that is being proposed has already passed to some kind of evaluation assessment system in your country, you can look into that as well. I, for example, had a very interesting experience looking into a project in Chile, which was this project wanted to build like a big solar panel plant. And during the night, it sucked water from the ocean and pushed it up to the top of a mountain with the solar energy. And then in the night, it would let the water fall and produce hydroelectric energy while the sun was not shining. Amazing, right? Well, so I got into the environmental impact assessment system of my country, which is really easy to access. Maybe not all these systems are the same in all countries. And I found like there was a place where people were participating. And I saw like these commentaries from a diver in Chile who was really worried about the project because he was saying that the water being sucked from the ocean was done without any safeguards to avoid larvae and little fishes being sucked in the tube. So I ended up having coffee with him and we prepared like very good interventions to speak about the problems with this project. So that was a very interesting way of getting to someone that had really interesting local knowledge on the project, something really good to contribute. So to finish, the next one, please. Then when you have all this information, you've written all your doubts and all the ideas that have come out, you can help write the intervention points that we are going to use. So what we do first is that we classify projects or program according to like a color scale. So green for projects that we think are okay, yellow for those that we are doubtful about, and red for those that we are really against, that we think that shouldn't get the funding as they are. Then another interesting thing when you are putting in order all your doubts and ideas is that you think of questions that you would ask the accredited entity, which is obviously the entity that is behind the project. Because many times, most of the times really, we have a possibility of have meetings with these accredited entities, so we can ask them questions. So it's very interesting to have questions from people that are on the ground, something that you don't understand, that you think is not well approached, etc., addressed. And then it's another interesting thing is that you can also think of conditions that you might like to propose to the project, because the board members, when they are approving a project, they have the possibility of saying, okay, we approve this project, but we need this and that condition. So maybe if you have an idea, like this project doesn't look so bad, but it would be great if, I don't know, there would be a third independent organization making sure that there is no, corruption or whatever. Whatever kind of condition, you can sort of propose that, and it might be part of the decision. And then the accredited entity will not get the funds until it complies with the conditions. So that was it. I know it was a lot of information. I'm going to give you access to this guide that I was talking about, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Florencia, for sharing your experience and the method you have developed to help other civil society organizations and communities engage with these very complex documents and try to really share their perspectives on potential projects. We are going to move to our second topic of the day. And as Florencia said, we'll take the questions at the end. I already saw there is something like a couple of questions. One of them is about the recording that we'll obviously share. And then the other one will have some time in the end to respond to that and any other questions. But now I want to give the floor to Liane Schalatek from the Heinrich Böll Stiftung. I'm sorry, I'm murdering that, even though I'm supposed to be a little bit better at this. But she will, as I mentioned, continue with the focusing on the GCF projects, giving us a bit of an idea about the different types of projects that the GCF can finance, the different types of approaches that are financed by the GCF as well, and that relationship to potentially false solutions instead of the solutions that will actually build resilience and have an impact in decreasing greenhouse gas emissions. So now I'll let Leanne take over.
Sorry, I had some trouble unmuting myself. Thanks so much for the introduction, Berta, and Florencia, really for laying the groundwork in going and explaining to us the complexity of GCF project proposals, project and program proposals, but also the importance of observers, civil society observers, observers from communities, observers from feminist organizations, observers from indigenous groups to really look into it. And while we have been rarely successful in outright preventing a project that we deem to be problematic to be approved, although we had 1 or 2 success stories where we were actually able to prevent a project from going through, we have been able to quite often either get concessions from the accredited entities through some of the conversations that we do beforehand to soften or improve some approaches, or actually influence some of the board conditions that the GCF board in approving the project puts forward. So I want to take a step back, and I hope that you can see the presentation and basically start out in talking and giving an overview where we actually even are with the portfolio of projects and programs in the Green Climate Fund. And you find all that information on the GCF website. But I think it's good for us to just get a little moment and see what are we really talking about when we talk about the GCF project and program portfolio. So after the last board meeting, which was in the mid of July, B33, the 33rd board meeting, we have now 200 approved projects and programs that are worth 10.8 billion in GCF supported funding. And since one of the pushes of the GCF Secretariat and one of the aims of the GCF really is to leverage additional finance, to leverage co-financing, the total value that they claim for those projects is about 40 billion. As you can see, unfortunately, despite the fact that direct access is one of the features really touted in the GCF, still the majority of the proposals of the approved projects, namely 156 or 78%, are still going through international access entity. And those are your multilateral development banks or your UN agency, but also your bilateral aid agencies from developed countries. And so just a much smaller percentage, 13% for national direct entities and 9% for regional direct entities is actually through the direct access modality. Also, if you look at the composition of the financial instruments, and the GCF can use a wide range of financial instruments, we see that by now grants and loans are still the majority, and they are about equal off. But I want to point out particularly the growing investment in equity, and particularly as that relates to private sector programs. And we will hear later that that causes very often quite a number of problems from our point of view, both in trying to monitor, but particularly in implementation. The projects are categorized by size, and you can see that they are categorized either as micro, small, medium, or large size projects or programs with corresponding financing tranches that range from 10 million for the micro component, and that actually is the financing from the GCF, as well as co-financing put together in order to talk about the size of a project up to large, which is more than 250 million. So if we are talking large, we are talking really large, and particularly in the context and in comparison to many other existing climate funds where project sizes are much smaller. The GCF can fund both the public and the private sector. It's noteworthy that the definition of what a public sector project is or program is and what a private sector program is a little bit wishy-washy. It is actually if the majority of financing comes from either public or the private sector. But this is unfortunately not straightforward because, for example, for many private sector projects or those categorized as private sector, you have actually quite a bit of public finance coming in, and you have leverage assumption of what the private sector might or often might not deliver, versus correspondingly in a lot of the public sector projects and programs, you do have significant amounts within the project or programs that is devoted to supporting the private sector. So nevertheless, according to the GCF, you see that they claim that you have a differentiation between the public and the private sector, largely 2 to 1, 2/3 to 1/3, but again, with the caveats that I have mentioned. I don't want to go much into it. Again, projects and programs are also categorized by risk. The risk category A is obviously the most severest risk. C is with minimal to no impact. Florencia already talked about some of the environmental and social safeguards disclosure and requirements. And I want to point out that the risk category is not just for project A, B, C, but it's also related to the intermediation, meaning if you have, for example, a financial institution that passes on money in the form of guarantees or in the form of loans, the categorization is highest risk, intermediation level of 1, medium risk, intermediation level of 2, and low intermediation level of I3. And again, this is important because a lot of the projects that we are talking about are not direct project implementation, but are actually financially intermediated projects and programs. I want to get to basically the 2 main project approval processes that we have in the Green Climate Funds. So one is called the PAP and the other one is called the SAP. The PAP is the proposal approval process. That is the general one through which most of the approved project and programs flow, 176 of the 200 approved so far. The SAP is the simplified approval process, which was started as a pilot, has just been recently updated, and is currently having just 24 projects, but with a tendency for more and more projects coming forward or wanting to come forward as the SAP. And so the proposal approval process for the normal project is where concept note is optional. It's for all sizes, environmental and social risk categories, for public and private, and all financial instruments. And it has the very comprehensive documentation required that Florencia mentioned earlier, including, and this is why I'm putting that up, a very long list of funding proposal annexes that are required for the approval process, for the normal approval process. However, and I think Florencia mentioned that also as well, with the exception of what is here listed as funding proposal annex 8, namely the gender assessment and action plan for each project or program. In the case of private sector projects or programs, those annexes are unfortunately not made public. Now, when you look at the SAP, the big selling point of the SAP, the simplified approval process, is the promise that it's really simplified procedures with lots of comprehensive proposal templates, should be much shorter, it's asking fewer questions, the streamline is supposed to be reviewed, and also the approval and disbursement procedures are supposed to be facilitated and accelerated. Although it's accessible to both international access entity and direct access entity, direct access entities are encouraged. The biggest difference, though, and that is in order to justify really the simplification of procedures as documentation, that it's only for micro and small scale activities. It used to be only up to 10 million. Now, with the latest revision, it's up to 25 million of GCF funding, which still means that a project with co-financing that comes under the SAP can be significantly larger. It can be public or private, and thus have all financial instruments, but And again, this is important. It has the reduced risk categorization. So it's only allowed at the moment for category C and for intermediation 3. I also wanted to point out that in addition to quote unquote the normal projects, we had a couple of ongoing pilot programs in the GCF with related requests for proposals, where you actually are looking for additional criteria when you're submitting a project under any of those pilot programs. Some of the ones that I just wanted to briefly mention here, and we don't have the time to go into that, but you can see how much all of the project proposals, the pilot programs add up to. It's about, at the moment, 10% of the approved funding of the GCF that goes through that pilot program. And the ones that are noteworthy is the enhancing direct access one, which is only for direct access entity, public and private. It's a 200 million pilot program. We have 3 projects so far. What is really important about that, it dissolves financing decisions to the national level. So it basically allows for the setup of small grants facilities, something that we would like to see much more of. But again, so far only 2 projects and programs have been approved. Then there is a program for the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. That's for the private sector only. Likewise, a 200 million one that again allows, for example, to bring in a focus on some of the local business actors that very, very often are the backbone of the economic power within recipient countries, but have very often access to finance problems. The simplified approval process we already mentioned. The one I want to point out is the mobilizing funding at scale. This is for the private sector only. It's a 500 million pilot. 50 projects and programs have been approved so far. That includes the example from Chile that Florencia has talked about, the combination of solar and hydropower one as an equity investment. And again, equity is something that we need to look in more critically, some of the activities that are proposed. And the last one is a RED Plus results-based payment program, which is for the public sector only. It's a 500 million pilot, which has been pretty much used up. And we are currently in the process of reviewing the pilot, and from a civil society and a CSO observer and GCF observer network perspective, it really needs some critical revisions and improvements because it is not functioning the way it should be, particularly in the with respect to the permanency of some of the reductions that are being mentioned. Just wanted to point out that there are quite a number of large-scale projects, 35 under the bench of the 200 approved projects and projects. 20 of those are multi-country programs. And when you look at the differentiation that I showed you before, and that's the one that is on the website, the percentage of large-scale projects as part of the 200 projects is relatively small, namely only 17%. If you actually look how much funding is flowing through those large-scale proposals, it's actually 5.4 billion. And I had to update the number after the last board meeting where another 2 large proposals, multi-country proposals, were approved. And that brings with it a number of problems. Hopefully we can talk about it a little bit more, that it's very top-down, it's removed from the realities on the ground, and it uses a financialization approach. So very often those are financing facility fund approaches with multiple levels of intermediation. And as we can see, that has a whole set of issues. The majority of those large-scale multi-country programs are private sector, and the increased transparency and accountability challenges are aggravated by the fact that those do not publicly disclose any annexes. We also don't see the secretariat assessment of those proposals. And if you think about it, it's really mind-boggling that for large-scale multi-country sectors with programs with the private sector, where we can talk about hundreds of millions of investment, we don't even see the Secretariat's assessment. And as I mentioned, they include many equity financing approaches with financing facilities with different levels of financial intermediation. So as a monitor, the attempt to follow the money is really stymied. It's very difficult. Some of the more general challenges of large-scale, both public and private, but particularly private multi-country programs, is that we would argue you have very reduced country ownership. A country has to issue a no objection letter, but in the case of those programs, those no objection letters are collected at the framework level. That means essentially the national designated authorities give a carte blanche. There are no separate letters of no objection for once you know which individual projects under a larger program are going to be pursued. Those multi-country programs, at best, if at all, have only indicative country allocations. So what you're selling is basically the promise to a country that they might receive some money under the multi-country programs, but it's actually usually not assured with a certain amount. And again, we have problems with reduced due diligence and oversight, and environmental and social assessment is only done at the framework level. So you have an environmental and social management framework that is approved. But very often, once you know what the individual, or often you don't know what the individual projects under that program is, it's difficult to get your hand on some of the sub-project level environmental and social safeguards disclosure. And there is often no or insufficient consultation of stakeholders at the program framework level. So very often we hear the Secretariat and the accredited entities basically say the justification, oh, we will consult with civil society, with local communities, with indigenous people. Once we know what the various project is, this is of course very problematic, because at the program level, you set the framework, the goals, the approaches that then are pursued at the individual level, and not having adequate and comprehensive consultation, including not receiving the free, prior and informed consent, particularly of indigenous peoples and local communities at the framework level, is a big problem. So let me then close out by basically just pointing out some of the dangers and sometimes realized connections to false solutions that we are seeing in project and program funding under the GCF. So first of all, the GCF has no exclusion list of funding approaches or funding certain types of technologies. And this is despite a continued GCF observer network push over the years. The GCF governing instruments, for example, explicitly names carbon capture and storage to be funded. And although there has been no proposal received yet or approved with that funding, we've actually seen some proposals that were trying through private equity approaches to bring in the possibility of carbon capture of storage. And obviously, we would argue that this is a false solution, because it would be a continuation of perpetuating a fossil fuel engagement and support. We also have seen quite a number of problems with the RED+ results-based finance programs, as well as several private sector forestry projects which have supported monoculture and often invasive species forestry approaches. One that I want to name here is FP125, the Abaro Fund, which is under one of those pilot programs for mobilizing funding at scale, and is an equity investment approach. And there are a lot of things where we're thinking this is not going in the right direction. There is still not quite clear whether and how the GCF in the future where they might end up on the sale of certified emissions reduction, while it's currently not yet allowed. Several of the approved proposals support carbon market development. And we have quite a bit of unclear understanding around issues related to nature-based solutions and terminologies like climate smart agriculture, both very controversial concepts. And while some of the language has been avoided, it's not clear that the approaches have been excluded from the proposals. And lastly, and I want to point that out, because if, for example, you would have engaged in some of the work on sector guidelines that have been developed on various sectors, on water security, on food security, and so on and so forth, you see that there is an undue focus in a lot of those projects on private sector leverage, and basically things like creating a new asset class, for example, for green infrastructure or for greening infrastructure. And a lot of those go over a focus on country ownership and sustainable development impact and local benefits. And that's it. And I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you for your interest and your attention.
Thank you very much, Liana, for that very comprehensive view into the different types of projects and the many, fortunately, rather many false solutions that the GCF is currently financing or would be able to finance in the future. I have seen more questions, so thanks for that. And if you still have some more, you can type them in the Q&A so that our panelists can answer them at the end of the webinar. In the meantime, I would really like to give the floor now to Helen Magata from Tepteba, the Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education, to give us a view into how how Indigenous peoples are integrated and engaged and are considered by the GCF through its different policies and projects. So yes, Helen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Bertha, and also thank you very much to Liana and Florencia, who have made very good presentations and made my presentation much easier by giving a very good introduction. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. That's from my side of the world, everyone. I'm thankful for AIDA for inviting, and for the GCF Watch Consortium for inviting us to be part of this webinar series. What I will be sharing is one of the crucial policy of the Green Climate Fund in terms of ensuring safeguards and human rights in its operations and also in its funding proposals, which was already, again, touched upon by our previous speakers. So let me just look at my notes. I'm not sure I can do the presentation from here. So if Victor can help show the PowerPoint presentation, that would be really helpful. Otherwise, I can just maybe do my intervention, and then maybe we can share the PowerPoint presentation. So the GCF Indigenous Peoples Policy was adopted in the 19th board meeting of the Green Climate Fund. That was in 2018, with the overall objective of ensuring that all GCF activities are developed, activities and projects are developed and implemented in a cultural and appropriate manner, and that nobody's going to suffer harm or adverse effects from these activities, and that all funding proposals or projects are going to be designed in a way that provides benefits and thus something good. So the next slide, please. The policy supports and promotes the welfare and positive contributions and leadership of Indigenous peoples, and not only as beneficiaries or grantees, and that indigenous peoples are fully informed and consulted and are actively participating in the project design and determination of project implementation arrangements with particular attention to gender dimensions. So even before the proposal gets to the GCF for review, as Florencia has presented, the Indigenous Peoples Policy provides that there should be a full consultation with Indigenous peoples and other potential affected communities. Actually, some of the principles of the Indigenous Peoples Policy is that it should promote and respect Indigenous peoples' rights to own, use, and control their lands, territories, and resources that they possess, and that it recognizes and respects and preserves the culture, knowledge, and practices of Indigenous peoples. One of the things that is also very, very interesting and also very important is the principle of free, prior, and informed consent, which I will be discussing more a bit later. So, and also the policy provides that the GCF should ensure that all grievance mechanisms are accessible, that they are fair and transparent, and they are culturally appropriate. Also that the GCF should operate in a manner that provides equitable access and also benefits for GCF funded activities. So what's the scope of application of the GCF IP policy? Next slide, please. So this policy will apply to Indigenous peoples as characterized in varying degrees by the following. So at the minimum, this policy will apply to Indigenous peoples as characterized in Article 1 of the ILO Convention 169. And I'm not going to go through all of the list, but that the GCF IP policy is going to apply to Indigenous peoples who have self-identified, and there's a recognition of identity by others. It's going to apply whether the Indigenous peoples do not, or it's going to be applied even if the Indigenous peoples do not have a legal title or legal tenure over their territories or lands and territories where the projects are going to be implemented in. As long as they have collective attachment to geographically distinct habitats or ancestral territories, or if these areas are of seasonal use or occupation of Indigenous peoples, as well as if these areas contain the natural resources where Indigenous peoples are doing their seasonal occupation and livelihood. So, for example, for pastoralists in Africa, they may not have legal tenure over the areas where they practice pastoralism, but the IB policy says that it's going to be implemented, or it's going to be applied anyway. This policy also is going to be applied, like the gender policy, which I believe is going to be discussed later, is going to be applied to all GCF finance activities by both public and private entities. And that is going to be applicable whenever Indigenous peoples are present in or have a collective attachment to these areas. This is why the accredited entities in the funding proposals, and I think this was already mentioned a while ago, that in the funding proposals, the accredited entities should show which Indigenous groups are going to be affected, or if they claim that there are no Indigenous peoples to be affected in the project implementation, they have to show proof and documentation that this is true, because it would be very easy for some accredited entities to just say that, no, this project is not going to affect Indigenous peoples at all. But as Florencia has mentioned, if we look at documents, or if we call back, or if we if we call our partners in countries, they would say that no, but these areas where the projects are going to be implemented are areas where Indigenous peoples are located. So The policy is also going to be applied regardless of whether indigenous peoples are affected positively or negatively. So there's no excuse by saying, oh, but the project is going to do good, so we don't have to undergo free, prior, or informed consent. Also, that indigenous peoples are, regardless if indigenous peoples are legally recognized in their countries, or if they are called many different names. We know other countries call them like ethnic minorities or Juma or Adivasi or indigenous cultural communities. It doesn't matter. The indigenous peoples policy is going to be applied anyway. Next slide, please. So there's a long list in the indigenous peoples policy that enumerates circumstances that require free, prior, and informed consent. But I think we're not going to discuss them one by one. And I think that for this webinar, we just want to focus on what free, prior, informed consent should look like according to the policy. So first, of course, it should be an iterative process. It should not be done only in the concept note stage, or only during the funding proposal stage, or right after the proposal. So it should be built in the different cycles of operation of projects and programs. And of course, the consent, that's why it's free and prior, because the consent should be obtained before any GCF activity is undertaken. And I think that's one of the source of a lot of frustration of many of those of us who are following the Green Climate Fund, because the funding proposals already come to the Green Climate Fund board for approval. And then we realize that accredited entities haven't even contacted indigenous peoples or indigenous groups or communities in the ground. And a lot of these proposals get approved anyway, with the caveat or with the conditions saying, or promises from the accredited saying that, okay, we're going to provide a documentation of how we are going to do free, the FPIC, which is, of course, it's not prior. So you cannot start doing any proposal or any activity for that matter. Or you should not be obtaining FPIC only when the proposal is done. Also, that FPIC should be based on the independent deliberation, decision-making processes of the communities, that is based on their customs and values, and of course based on the information that is provided to them, and in a manner that is understood by them. And the end result of an FPIC should not always be yes. So a no answer should also be respected. Yeah, the other principle that I wanted to also raise is that the indigenous peoples policy provides that it respects the rights of indigenous peoples under voluntary isolation, and that when GCF finance activities may potentially affect remote groups or peoples in voluntary isolation, the accredited entity will take all appropriate measures to recognize, respect, and protect their lands, territories, and environment, and to avoid contact with them as a consequence of the activity. And the aspects of the GCF finance project that would result in undesired contact will not be processed further. I think this is very, very important. That the GCF will also enhance the capacity of indigenous peoples within the GCF, and among indigenous peoples themselves. Why within the GCF? Because we believe that there are NDAs, governments, and also accredited entities, and also the GCF itself. A lot of them honestly do not understand the issues and concerns of indigenous peoples, and do not see why they should be talking about they should be talking and partnering with indigenous peoples. And the last principle that I wanted to raise is that the GCF indigenous peoples policy respects the system of self-government of indigenous peoples, and many of the governments are not very happy about this, because the policy provides that the GCF should promote and respect for the right of indigenous communities to freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development, and the right to autonomy and self-government in matters that are relating to their internal and local affairs. Next. So what are the roles and responsibilities of the Green Climate Fund and accredited entities towards the implementation of the GCF IP policy? And what does it mean? I mean, in practical terms, what does it mean? So the GCF and accredited entities need to involve and take into account the interest of indigenous peoples, and that consultations should be done at the regional, national, or even subnational levels, that will provide sufficient time for indigenous peoples to, again, be able to decide freely. It will also need to assess and facilitate the capacity of indigenous peoples to engage and to engage meaningfully, because I mean, a one-day meeting in English or in a national language, which might not be very culturally understandable to indigenous peoples, is not, of course, equal to proper engagement. And also that indigenous peoples and accredited entities should come up with appropriate engagement process as early as possible, and that is commensurate with the scale of impact and vulnerability of the communities. And in the there's some elements of what an indigenous people's planning framework would look like, or what an indigenous people's plan would look like. So it could be different from one accredited entity to the other. It could be different from one proposal to the other, but it basically says that accredited entities and indigenous peoples should come up with a process how to go forward from the conception to the implementation to evaluation and monitoring and so on and so forth. Next, it's also that there's a need to look at the delivery and distribution of compensation and shared benefits. So while the policy says that avoidance of adverse impacts will be avoided to maximum extent possible, but if adverse impacts are unavoidable, the accredited entities will minimize and compensate for these impacts in a culturally appropriate manner. But also there's another element, which is compensation and shared benefit. So compensations can either be done individually or collectively based on or a combination of both. But it should take into account the nature and context of the GCF finance activities, and should identify opportunities that will aim to address the goals and preferences of the affected indigenous peoples indigenous peoples in a community. And then I think this is going to be the second to the last slide. About the grievance mechanism. So the grievance mechanism should be designed in consultation with potentially affected indigenous peoples. And grievances should be facilitated promptly. It should be accessible. It should be transparent and constructive process. So anybody, just an individual or a community can just present the complaints. They can write them or take a video or an audio or email anonymously. It should be appropriate and readily accessible, as I've said. It should consider customary laws if there are existing customary laws of grievance and redress mechanism in the community. Also that it should include appeals process if the grievances are not satisfied with how it was dealt with in the accredited entities or at the country level. It should not impede the access to administrative remedies that may be available throughout the country, and should also not preclude the option to use the accountability mechanism, grievance mechanism of the Green Climate Fund. So we have the Green Climate Fund redress mechanism. And the implementation arrangements is going to be my last slide. So the board of the Green Climate Fund oversees and reviews the implementation of the policy. A senior indigenous people specialist has already been hired to have the operational responsibility to manage and oversee the implementation of this policy. There's also a very newly constituted Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group. The role of the advisory group is to provide advice to the Secretariat, to the accredited entities, or to the GCF, including the board, as may be requested. So the first Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group meeting is happening later this month. So that's 6 years after the, is it 6 years? After the adoption of the IB policy. So I mean, overall, I think the policy itself is very robust in paper. But again, I think the best measure of how good a policy is how it's really being implemented on the ground. And we are very thankful for opportunities like this, because this is where we are calling for and encouraging our colleagues, our friends, our networks from the civil society organizations, from Indigenous peoples, communities and organizations, and also from our local communities, to ensure that we call for the GCF to adhere to its own policies, by adhering to the highest standards out there. So again, thank you very much, and I hope to hear from you. Happy to hear if you have questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Helen. And I think it would be very interesting in the Q&A to hear more about what you think about the level of implementation of this policy, and how well the GCF is adhering to this really important policy through its projects and programs. But before we get to that point, and I think there's already some questions for you in the chat anyway, I would like to leave the floor to our last speaker from today, Natalia Daza, who is a GCF gender monitor for Latin America, to tell us more about what the gender policy and its implementation in the GCF is, and you know, and maybe her views as well on how well implemented this policy is when we look at the current portfolio of projects and programs. So Natalia, the floor is yours.
All right, so thank you very much. Wait a second. Sorry, so I had a last minute issue. So first I'm going to talk about the overall group, and then I'm going to go to the gender policy. So the first thing is present you what is the GCF Gender Monitoring Group for Latin America and the Caribbean. Basically, it's a group that was established thanks to the support of WIDO, of the Women Environment and Development Organization. And basically, what they have right now, it's a group of women's rights organizations, environmental organizations, and human rights organizations which work on gender and climate change, or are interested in the gender and climate nexus. And we've been working for the group has been working for about 4 years, but basically this year I have been leading the group. So I will tell you about how we've been working and what have been the main challenges, and then I can go into the gender policy. I had mainly prioritized this part of the presentation. So can we put the next slide, please? So basically, we have four main pillars of what we do. The first one is capacity building, and that is related to capacity related to understanding the overall working of the GCF, understanding the overall world of climate finance, and most importantly, how it relates to gender. We also have capacity building related to advocacy strategies, both at the GCF level, but also for them to engage at the national level with the national designated authorities, as well as to contact the different projects that might be taking place in their countries. We also provide updates on the GCF policies, programs, and projects. And here is one thing that we have talked with Florencia, and it's understanding ourselves as interpreters. Most of the times, these organizations and social movements have limited time to work specifically on the Green Climate Fund. One thing that happens, I think, specifically with the topic of climate finance is because it's highly, I think it's highly detailed and it has a lot of technicisms. It's sometimes difficult for the social movements and other and NGOs overall to engage if they don't have any specific project on climate finance. So we basically try to make the information of what is going on in the GCF easier for the civil society organizations, including what policies are being updated, programs and the projects that are being presented in the board meetings. We have also talked about projects in progress, but I think that we have tried to center ourselves in existing projects. We also monitor gender, specifically both in GCF policies and projects, specifically projects in the region of Latin America and the Caribbean. So whenever there's an upcoming GCF meeting, what we basically do is present the projects that will be developed at some point in Latin America. We try to do a participatory and engaging workshop in which we can think about different ways in which gender might or should be included beyond what is assessed in the gender action plans. Definitely, there's sometimes that the gender action plans include some interesting elements, but most of the times it's a pretty big overall understanding of gender, and that's where we try to provide meaningful insights so we can build a specific demands on the specific issue of gender. And we also develop advocacy strategy, whether it's on specific policies that will take place, on if we ever when there are specific funding proposals which are of high risk to us, not only in terms of gender but overall in terms of human rights and environment. We organize ourselves to try to get in contact with the largest amount of people who might help us to mobilize, whether it is providing meaningful comments and questions at the level of the board meetings, but also if we think that it deserves to be taken to the IRM at some point, we try to organize on that as well. So let's go with the next slide, please. So here, basically, I have this in Spanish, sorry for the audience, but basically this is what we call a evaluation tool for gender action plans. And basically what we have is a document which was created by Tara and Andrea from We Do, and basically it provides a overall assessment for funding proposals. We have been doing this for 1 year, and what we're looking for at this moment is to have the evaluations, or at least a summary of the evaluations, published sometime this year. We really hope so. But basically this helps in 2 different ways. The first one is of what our participants have told us, is that the tool itself helps not only to see gender mainstreaming at the level of the funding proposals of the GCF, but the tool by itself has also served for them for different climate change projects. But also at the same time, it makes it easier for us to track the progress of the gender action plans at this point. So next slide, please. All right, and I will go with the main challenges. I have two presentations for now, as I told you. I was solving a personal issue. So I was basically bringing two presentations together. The first one is, as I told you, the overall understanding of climate finance, especially when there's a limited time availability of the participants of the group, and a limited amount of resources. I think that there's very little or few organizations overall in Latin America who dedicate time to the issue of climate finance, specifically related to the GCF. But overall, climate finance, most of what is talked about climate finance is related more to private finance and risk management. So most of those efforts are concentrated there, and there's little advocacy efforts. So I think that's one of the main challenges. And once again, that has to do with time availability, but also with availability of resources as well. Engaging with NDAs, it has also proved really difficult. We have tried to engage at different points, but it has been absolutely difficult. And we have tried to find the contacts and get in touch. It has been really difficult. And once again, when this is made with limited time availability, I think that in advocacy, we all know that to get to talk to this type of people in governments is extremely difficult unless you have a lot of time and insist a lot. But once again, we have limited time, so that makes it really difficult. And then contacting communities in which projects are being developed. As we all know, the current GCF portfolio, most of it is under implementation. And right now, the priorities of the group are changing, although we have done a huge and a really interesting effort in monitoring the funding proposals in terms of gender. We have not been able to contact the communities as we would like to. So I think that's one of the challenges that come from the future. And once again, that has to do with time availability and availability of resources. But basically, that's how the work has been working and the challenges we have faced. And I think that also poses some questions on how we can proceed with advocacy in these conditions. And yes, so I will close this presentation. I also have one specifically on the gender policy of the GCF gender policy. So if I could share the screen, sorry about the bilingual issue here, since we'll have a presentation in English and then one in Spanish. But once again, I've been running with a personal issue. So Victor, would it be possible for me to present? Thank you very much. I need to, oh, okay, there we go. So please give me 1 second. Sorry, I'm trying to get the presentation, but I will take the time to share with you something I have here, which I consider is relevant to what the work we've been doing. So I will share it first of all this thing with you. Are you seeing the poster I have on my screen? Okay, so basically, this is a type of materials we also make as part of the group, and is in a specific bulletin, which has or like, so here you can see it has a summary of what the proposal is about. We also have like an introduction of what are the board meetings of the GCF. Then we have what types of decisions are taken at the boards of the GCF. And then we have the two proposals that were presented in this case for B33. We have then summary of the proposal, and then we have a summary of what we think are the main concerns of a civil society. Once again, we are trying not to have all the civil society organizations to go through this, because we know that time for them is limited, but if in case they see any specific issue with the proposal that is at place, or have any specific comment. For example, in this case, we had a program related to green hydrogen, and we are not experts in green hydrogen. We also put this in a available format to the public, so we are able to have like expert allies coming to us and telling us like, hey, I saw that you had a proposal on green hydrogen. I know about this topic. Let me help you with this. And this is like another way we once again, we see ourselves as interpreters, like us being able to read easily, go through the proposals, and also summarizing the information we consider relevant to once again put it back to the civil society organizations, and then finding ourselves supported easily. And I have the presentation right here. Sorry, my apologies for the issues with the presentation.
Hi, Natalia. Sorry, if it's not too much, maybe we can move to the Q&A because
Yeah,
we
sure.
are right on time, and my apologies. Yeah, I would like to apologize to all for we started a few minutes late, so we would like to have a little bit of time and ask for your patience to answer some of the questions that have been raised in the chat, so that at least we can like address some of them real quick. And yeah. So I would like to start with a few that, like, for example, there's one directed at Florencia, and I would like for everyone to try to answer the question as concisely as possible, given that we've already we have 1 minute left of the original time specified, but maybe if participants allow us, we can take a few more minutes to try to go through them all. So there's one for Florencia about updating congratulating her first for updating the information in Spanish, and asking basically how far behind are we in transferring the information to local languages of native societies in the region. I'm guessing you mean Latin America in this case, since all the written information would help to to like carry on the projects in the future. So I would like to start with that one for Florencia. There's others that are more general, so I'll ask all of the panelists afterwards. But let's start with that one specifically. There's quite a few for Helen as well. So Florencia, if you can answer real quick that question. That would
okay, I'm quite aware of time, so sorry for taking extra minutes, but really, really quickly, the project proposals for the GCF have to be submitted in English. That's part of the GCF programming manual. But so we're not very far ahead there. But the environmental and social impact assessments that they have to give, that accredited entities have to give in for projects that might have worse impacts, those have to be disclosed in English and in the local language. However, local language does not include native languages that are not official to a country. So there is a job to be done there. Obviously, accredited entities could go further voluntarily, but I think that is one of the many battles that we should fight, especially when a project is going to affect a majority of people that do not speak the official language. I think that is very important for our countries in Latin America and Asia, Africa, that there are a lot of indigenous languages going around. So thank you. Berta? Did we lose you?
Yeah, I think we lost Berta. Maybe Helen, there were a couple of questions directed at you and it might be good to pick those up.
I have them here. I can ask the question for Helen. Helen.
I also read them. Thank you very much for this very important questions. And if you allow me, maybe I can just use the time to answer at least two, I think 2 or 3 of them, about how much indigenous peoples are trained so they are capable of really carrying out projects or engaging. I agree, this is very important questions. Actually, we have been advocating for the possibility of earmarking or allocating some funds from the Green Climate Fund for direct access for indigenous peoples or for women or for CSOs at the national level. But the answer that we had was no earmarking, because the mandate of the Green Climate Fund is 50% mitigation and 50% adaptation. So as of now, the short answer to the question is there's no specific program for indigenous peoples in the GCF. We have lots of experiences that we can speak of or examples that we can share of how things the GCF can do better, but all of this are self-initiatives of indigenous peoples organizations and also CSOs. Like we have our own learning workshops, learning sessions, national engagements with accredited entities and NDAs, for instance. So capacity building is creatively transferred accountability to the accredited entities who are oftentimes clueless or do not have idea to do it, or it's their list of their priorities. Sometimes they have indigenous peoples programs or frameworks for some projects, but they do not necessarily have resources to include capacity building of indigenous peoples in the proposals. So the GCF has, for instance, global programming conferences for private sector for them to have more capacity for direct access entities to learn more about the processes of the GCF, but it doesn't happen for indigenous peoples or for CSOs. We only get invited to this programming conferences because we insist. I'm sorry, I cannot provide more response as to what the GCF is doing in terms of capacity building for indigenous peoples. About the RED Plus comment or question, I agree that some accredited entities see the GCF policies as hindrances or encumbrances to their implementation of projects. But I agree that actually these policies are in place to facilitate things if they are complied with in the first place. For instance, there's the first project that was approved ever by the Green Climate Fund. It was adopted in 2015, and we raised a lot of concerns about the violation of FPIC during the time, but it was adopted anyway. A few years after, there was a self-initiated inquiry of the independent redress mechanism of the Green Climate Fund to look back about how the accredited entity violated FPIC. So they had to invest a lot of resources. They had to redo a lot of processes for them to be able to comply with the Green Climate Fund policy. So of course, it took them a lot of resources and also could do reputational risk, not only to the GCF, but also to the accredited entity. And last comment is about the debate on whether to use ethnic minorities or, ethnic peoples or indigenous peoples. I think, yes, of course, this is a debate. The debate about this terminology would warrant a separate time for us to discuss. But the IP policy is very clear that regardless of the terminology or regardless of the legal stature of indigenous peoples or ethnic minorities in the countries, the indigenous peoples policy is going to apply anyway. So thank you very much, and over.
Thanks, Helen, and apologies because my internet just dropped. So I will have the last question for Liana. There's a question about whether there's any prospects for a decentralized GCF financing process, because the speaker says, as far as we know, monitoring and results are diffuse and local and ethnic communities suffer from multiple exclusions of all kinds. So what can be done?
Yeah, thank you. And I mean, I'm not going to go too much into some of the issues that I think Helen's answer already provided, but I wanted to go to the financing aspect, namely the question, what kind of decentralized funding is there available, or should there be available? And the short answer is, at the moment, there is not much. The financing approach is very much with a trickle-down assumption that does not work. One of the only few exceptions that we have is under one of the pilot programs that I mentioned, the Enhancing Direct Access one. Unfortunately, again, only 3 projects approved under that. But that in its setup, with the understanding that financing decisions are devolved, is very supportive of, for example, small grants and approaches that then could allow communities, civil society groups to actually access smaller funding, with the decision on the smaller funding, who receives them or not, being made at the national level. There's also some opportunity, and this is advocacy that we are pushing, to actually have, as part of larger projects, such small grants facilities integrated and, for example, then done by executing partners of an accredited entity that could, for example, be a local women's fund or a local women's group. So far, there has been very little incentive, and the Secretariat, for example, has not pushed or mandated that accredited entities are doing that, but that is there. And the last one, and I think at the moment, with the GCF looking at updating its strategic plan and going into its next replenishment phase, there is also an opportunity to push again what has been a long-standing demand by civil society, namely to have such a small grants mechanism or program that would allow civil society group, local communities to access funding directly from the GCF, given out by the Secretariat, so not through board decision, set up at the Secretariat level. And I just want to close out by saying there are examples of that, something like that exists and can work. So the small grants program under the Global Environment Facility could be mentioned, where you actually have local or national then kind of committees that decide about funding approaches, or the dedicated grant mechanism under the Forest Investment Program, which is one of the climate investment funds, which also showcase that it's possible to have small amounts of funding that are self-governed, with a set aside at a programmatic level on the Secretariat's level. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Liane, for giving us some perspectives on what the GCF could be doing to really make decentralized financing available. And with that, I would like to thank all of our speakers, not only for this session, but overall throughout the 4 webinars that we've had this year, for sharing their experience, their knowledge about the GCF in all the different topics. And thanks to all of the participants as well, especially those that have joined us for more than one of the webinars. We really hope that this has helped you understand these rather complex fund a little bit better. I know there's always a lot of questions that are still pending, because there's so many topics, there's so many issues that could be addressed. We invite you all to engage more with the GCF if this is of interest to you, especially to make sure that the Green Climate Fund, as all of our experts are doing and have shown, is really listening to the issues that are relevant to civil society and communities and indigenous people from all of the different perspectives, including gender. So thank you very much, and hopefully see you maybe next year for another round of webinars on the GCF Watch. As Florencia has said, we'll be sharing with everyone the recordings and all of the information so that you can rewatch, share extensively with all of your networks. Thank you, everyone, and have a good morning, afternoon, evening.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.